Through the many incarnations we experience in this world, perhaps the most difficult journey is the one we take within ourselves. The Buddha taught that all suffering comes from attachment, but few understand that the deepest attachment of all is the belief that happiness is always outside of us, always in the company of others. This is the story of a monk who, despite his sacred vows and years of practice, had yet to learn the most fundamental lesson of all: how to be at peace with his own company. The temple bell had just rung, marking the end of the evening meditation. The stone courtyards of the ancient monastery, built centuries ago on the mountainside, filled with the gentle sounds of sandals and hushed conversations. The monk remained seated a little longer, watching his fellow practitioners form small circles of conversation. There was an ease in the way they interacted, as if they naturally belonged to one another, as if those connections flowed effortlessly. At last, he rose, adjusted his ochre robes, and walked toward one of the groups. He positioned himself at the edge of the circle, smiling politely, but the words died before reaching his lips. A comment about the weather, an observation about meditation, everything sounded artificial when rehearsed in his mind. Gradually, unnoticed by anyone, he stepped away. His feet carried him back to the small cell he had called home for the past 8 years. The simplicity of the room was meant to inspire peace. A thin mattress, a low table with an incense holder, a small window overlooking the valley. But that night, as on so many others, the walls seemed to close in around him. The silence, meant to nourish his practice, weighed on his chest like a stone. He sat on the mat, trying to meditate, but his restless mind jumped from thought to thought like a wild monkey, leaping from branch to branch. Perhaps a walk, he told himself, knowing perfectly well where his steps would truly lead him. The descent along the mountain path was steep and treacherous at dusk, but he knew every stone along the way. He had traveled it many times, more than his brothers could ever imagine. The sky darkened as he reached the outskirts of the small town in the valley. He stopped by an old oak tree, glanced around to make sure no one was watching, and retrieved a bundle hidden among its exposed roots. Inside were simple clothes, plain as those of a farmer. The transformation was quick. The monk's robes were carefully folded and hidden, his shaved head covered with a straw hat. Anyone who saw him now would take him for a laborer returning home after a day in the fields. But he was not going home. He followed the sound of music and laughter coming from the central square. It was festival night. Colorful lanterns lit up the plaza. Vendors offered food and drinks. Musicians played traditional instruments while young people danced. The monk stood at the edge of the crowd, feeling a mix of shame and exhilaration. He knew he was breaking his vows simply by being there, but the hunger for human connection was stronger than his commitment to the monastery's rules. "Hey, you look lost." A cheerful voice pulled him from his thoughts. A group of young men and women, their faces flushed from alcohol and dancing, waved him over. "Come join us. No one should be alone on a night like this." The invitation was all he needed to hear. He walked toward them, a hesitant smile on his lips, his heart pounding half in excitement, half in panic. Before long, he was sitting at an improvised table, a cup of sweet liquor in his hands, nodding along to stories he barely understood, laughing at jokes he didn't find funny. "You're not from around here, are you?" "I've never seen you before," asked a young woman with long braids. "I'm from a distant village," he lied, the bitter taste of falsehood mixing with the sweetness of the liquor. "Just passing through." "Then we have to make this night unforgettable for you," another young man exclaimed, raising his cup in a toast. And so the hours passed. He drank when offered, danced when pulled to dance, agreed with opinions that contradicted everything he believed in. With every moment, every new interaction, he desperately searched in the eyes of others for some sign of acceptance, some confirmation that he belonged there among them. Occasionally, He thought he had found it, a genuine smile, a touch on the shoulder, a look of understanding. Occasionally, he thought he had found it, a genuine smile, a touch on the shoulder, a look of understanding. But they were only fleeting moments, small islands in an ocean of disconnection. By the end of the night, as the festival dispersed and his new friends said their goodbyes with vague promises to meet again, the monk felt emptier than ever. There was something deeply unsatisfying about these surface-level connections. Like eating food without substance, it seemed to fill him at the moment, but soon left an even greater hunger. On the way back to the tree where he had left his robes, he recalled a story his master used to tell often, the story of Angulimala, the murderer who wore a necklace of his victim's fingers, believing that once he collected 1,000, he would attain some form of power or liberation. When the Buddha encountered him, he revealed the futility of his quest. No number of severed fingers could bring Angulimala what he truly sought. I'm not so different from him, the monk thought, as he removed his peasant clothes and put his robe back on. I collect moments of false belonging, just as he collected fingers, believing that one day I'll have enough to finally feel whole. The climb back to the monastery that night was harder than usual. Not just because of the fatigue from a sleepless night or the lingering effect of alcohol in his system, but because of the weight of the reflections that accompanied him. By the time he reached his cell, the sun was beginning to rise. He lay down, knowing he would miss the morning meditation. His last thought before drifting into uneasy sleep was that despite all the people he had been with, despite all the words exchanged and smiles shared, he had never felt so utterly alone. The sound of firm knocks on his cell door woke the monk. The light streaming through the small window suggested it was already past noon. He sat up abruptly, his head throbbing, his mouth dry. For a moment, he couldn't tell whether the discomfort came from the drink of the previous night or the shame now consuming him. "Come in," he said, his voice still hoarse from sleep. The door opened to reveal the serene, wrinkled face of his master. The old monk showed neither surprise nor reproach at finding him still in bed at this hour. He simply entered, sat calmly on the mat beside the mattress, and placed a small bowl of tea on the ground between them. "Drink," he said simply. "It will help with the headache." The younger monk obeyed, avoiding his master's gaze. The tea was bitter, with a faint herbal aroma he couldn't identify. As he drank, he realized his master was watching him intently, not with judgment, but with a compassionate curiosity that somehow was even harder to bear. "How long have you known?" he finally asked, placing the empty bowl on the ground. "It doesn't matter," the old man replied. "What matters is how much longer you will continue in this cycle." Silence hung between them. This was not the first time his master had found him in such a state, nor was it the first silent conversation they had about his nighttime escapades. But there was something different this time, a certain finality in the air that made the younger monk shrink inwardly. "The mountain calls to us in different ways," the master finally said. "For some, it is a refuge. For others, a prison. For you, my son, it has been a bit of both, hasn't it?" It wasn't a question that required an answer. The master continued, "There is a small temple at the peak of the eastern mountain. It has been empty for some time. The roof needs repairs. The garden is neglected. I thought perhaps you could take care of it for a while." The younger monk felt his chest tighten. He knew that temple. It was isolated, at least 2 days' walk from the main monastery, far from any village. It was where monks were sent when they needed enforced solitude, whether as punishment or as an opportunity to deepen their practice. "For how long?" he asked, his voice barely audible. 2 weeks, maybe more. "However long is necessary." Necessary for what? The master did not specify. He didn't need to. They both knew this was about more than repairing a roof or tending to a garden. "Leave at dawn tomorrow," the master said, rising to his feet. I will provide enough supplies to last you the entire period. The rest you will find there." Before leaving, the old monk turned once more. "Do not see this as a punishment, but as a gift. Few have the opportunity to truly find themselves." When the door closed, the younger monk remained seated, motionless. A gift? How could complete isolation be a gift? The thought of spending 2 weeks alone, without the distractions of monastery rituals, without the possibility of slipping away into the city, felt almost like torture. Finally, he stood and began gathering his few belongings. A begging bowl, an extra robe, his wooden prayer beads. Each item felt heavy in his hands, as if laden with the weight of the lonely days ahead. The next day, he left as instructed, while the sky was still purple with the first light of dawn. The path was arduous, winding up ever narrower and steeper trails. At another time, he might have appreciated the journey, the breathtaking views of the valley below, the crisp mountain air, the birdsong accompanying him. But his mind was heavy, occupied only with what awaited him: solitude, silence, and the inevitable confrontation with himself. He reached the small temple at the end of the second day. It was even smaller than he remembered, just a modest main shrine with a weathered Buddha statue, a meditation hall, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom no larger than a closet. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, a silent witness to how long the place had been abandoned. The roof, as his master had mentioned, was damaged in places, letting in rain that had stained the wooden walls. The garden surrounding the temple was overgrown with weeds, the small ceremonial pond filled with dried leaves. After setting his belongings down in the tiny room, the monk immediately began working. He swept the floors, wiped down surfaces, arranged a few pieces of furniture. He worked until nightfall, lighting a small lantern to continue. Only when his arms ached and his eyes burned with exhaustion did he allow himself to stop and prepare a simple meal from the supplies he had brought. Sitting alone in near complete darkness, eating his plain rice, he realized that the silence around him was unlike any he had ever experienced. At the monastery, even in the quietest hours, there were always sounds, the distant footsteps of another monk, the rustling of pages being turned in late-night study, the whisper of prayers. Here, there was nothing but the wind in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. "Only 2 weeks," he said aloud, startling himself with the sound of his own voice in the empty space. "I can endure anything for 2 weeks." But when he finally lay down to sleep on the thin mattress that smelled of mildew, the silence seemed to press against his ears like something solid. He closed his eyes, trying to meditate as he had thousands of times before, but his mind refused to settle. Thoughts, memories, regrets, fears all seemed to shout louder in the mountain silence. Sleep did not come. Hour after hour, he tossed and turned on the mattress, trying different positions, different breathing techniques. Nothing worked. Around midnight, he got up again and lit the lantern. If he couldn't sleep, he would work. He spent the rest of the night reorganizing the few sacred texts he found on a small shelf, cleaning them page by page, even though they didn't need it. When the sun finally rose, he was exhausted but unable to rest. He forced himself to sit in meditation for an hour, as he would have at the monastery. But his mind leapt like a restless frog from thought to thought. "One day has passed," he told himself. "Only 13 more." The following days followed the same pattern. The monk kept himself busy from dawn to dusk with unnecessary tasks, cleaning already clean areas, rearranging already organized objects, repairing minor damages that barely needed attention. He spoke aloud to himself as he worked, reciting sutras from memory, retelling stories he had heard, sometimes simply narrating what he was doing. "Now I am sweeping this corner. Now I am polishing this statue." Anything to fill the silence. At night, sleep continued to elude him. When exhaustion finally forced him to doze off, his dreams were restless, filled with faces of people he had met in the city, unfinished conversations, laughter that turned into weeping. On the third day, the loneliness became unbearable. He remembered his master mentioning a small village at the foot of the mountain, a few hours' walk away. The master had not said he couldn't leave the temple, only that he was to take care of it. "I need to check if I have enough supplies," he justified to himself, though he knew full well that his master's provisions were more than sufficient for 2 weeks. He hurried down the trail, almost running at some points, eager to hear another human voice, to see another face. The village was small, just a handful of houses clustered around the communal well. As he arrived, he felt the curious gazes of the few inhabitants. A lone monk descending from the mountain was not an everyday occurrence. He approached an elderly woman sitting at her doorstep, peeling vegetables. "Blessings upon this home," he said, bowing in greeting. "I am staying at the temple on the mountain for a time. I came to bring food for the elders?" The old woman interrupted with a smile. "The last monk did that. He came every week with vegetables from the temple garden. Of course, he had brought nothing, but the memory of the previous monk's gesture gave him an idea. "Yes, exactly," he said. "But unfortunately, the garden isn't producing yet. I came to see if I could help in some way." Soon, he was sitting at the woman's table, listening to stories about the village, its people, the hardships of the past winter. For the first time in days, his heart felt at ease. There was something comforting in the simple presence of another human being. The days that followed brought a new routine to the mountain temple. Each morning, the monk awoke with the first rays of sunlight, and his first action was to check on the injured bird. To his delight, the small creature seemed to be recovering well. It ate the grains offered, drank water, and although it could not yet fly, it was already hopping around the box with increasing vigor. "Good morning, little friend," became his first words of the day, simple words that, in some way, anchored him in the present in a way that elaborate religious rituals never had. The monk settled into a routine that emerged naturally, not imposed by external rules or expectations. At dawn, he sat in meditation for a time, not measured by clocks, but by his own internal rhythm. Sometimes it was only a few minutes. Other times, an entire hour passed without him noticing. He did not force his mind to quiet. He simply observed its nature, like someone watching a river flow. After meditation, he prepared a simple meal for himself and the bird. He ate mindfully, savoring each bite of plain rice, preserved vegetables, and the herbs he had begun gathering around the temple. Often, he found himself talking to the bird during these meals, sharing thoughts that arose, observations about the weather, memories that surfaced. He did not expect answers, of course, but there was something liberating about simply expressing what came to mind without fear of judgment. The rest of the morning was dedicated to repairing the temple, which had been damaged by the storm. Slowly, day by day, he fixed the most leaky parts of the roof, dried and reorganized the dampened texts, and cleared the mud that the water had carried inside. He no longer worked with the desperate urgency of the first days, but with a quiet patience. The temple had survived for centuries. A few more days or weeks would make no difference. The afternoons were devoted to the garden. At first, his goal was merely to clear the mess left by the storm-fallen branches, uprooted plants, ruined flower beds. But soon, he discovered a deep satisfaction in working with the earth. He began replanting what had been damaged, reorganizing the garden beds, creating new spaces for herbs and flowers. He did not know much about gardening, and he certainly made mistakes. Some plants withered under his inexperienced care. Others sprouted in unexpected places, as if defying his plans. But there was a lesson in this too, the acceptance that not everything was under his control, that life had its own flow and rhythm. As the garden slowly came back to life under his care, something within him also blossomed. a calm he had never known before, a contentment that did not depend on external circumstances. He was surprised to realize that he no longer counted the days until he could return to the main monastery. The thought of going back to the city in search of hollow connections now seemed strange and distant, like a half-forgotten dream. One afternoon, while working in the garden, he noticed that the bird had left its box and followed him outside. The small creature still could not fly completely, but it hopped around him, occasionally testing its wings in small flights that resembled extended jumps. "You're getting better, little friend," he said, watching with a smile. "Soon, you'll be ready to return to your world." The idea that the bird would eventually leave no longer brought the fear of loneliness that once would have consumed him. He had learned that true connection did not depend on constant presence, nor was it diminished by separation. The care he had given, without expectation of return, had created a bond that transcended the need for physical closeness. This transformation reflected the teaching of the Metta Sutta, in which the Buddha instructs on cultivating loving-kindness, metta, first for oneself and then for all beings. As the text says, just as a mother protects her only child with her own life, cultivate a boundless heart for all creatures. The monk began to understand that true love, whether for other beings, for nature, or for himself, was rooted in freedom, not attachment. To love was to allow each being to follow its own path, offering support when needed, but without trying to control or possess. With this understanding, his relationship with silence also changed. What had once been an oppressive emptiness became a space of infinite possibilities. In the silence, he could hear the whisper of the wind in the leaves, the distant song of birds, the murmur of a newly formed stream from the rain. And most importantly, he could hear the subtle movements of his own heart, his desires, his fears, his hopes, without judgment or resistance. One day, while meditating in the garden at sunset, he had a sudden and profound realization. His entire life, he had sought to fill a perceived emptiness within him, with external approval, with knowledge, with spiritual practices, with fleeting connections. But he had never truly looked at that emptiness directly, with compassion and curiosity. Now, sitting quietly as the sun set behind the mountains, he dared to look. And what he found was not the bottomless abyss he had feared, but a space of infinite potential, like an empty vessel that could be filled with anything, or like a clear sky where anything could arise. The emptiness he had feared so much was not the absence of something, but the very condition that made all experience possible. As the Buddha taught in Sunyata, emptiness, there was no fixed, unchanging self to be filled or satisfied, only a continuous flow of experiences, always changing, always renewing. This understanding was not intellectual, but visceral, felt in every cell of his body. And with it came a wave of compassion, first for himself, and then expanding to encompass all beings who, like him, sought happiness and escape from suffering, often in the wrong places. That night, under a starry sky, the monk sat in the garden with his small bird companion beside him. He no longer needed to speak constantly to fill the silence. A deeper communication was taking place, a silent exchange of presence and acceptance. The next morning, he woke to find the bird perched on the edge of the open window. Its wings were fully healed, and it flapped them gently, as if testing their strength. "You are ready," the monk said, with a mixture of joy and a hint of sadness, which he recognized and accepted as natural. The bird turned its small head toward him, as if it understood. For a long moment, they looked at each other, the man and the bird, both transformed by their brief time together. "Go," the monk finally said. "Live your life fully." With one last chirp, the bird launched into the air. Its wings beat strongly, lifting it in ever higher spirals until it became just a speck in the vast blue sky. The monk watched until the bird disappeared completely from sight. Then he turned back to his daily tasks, meditation, repairing the temple, tending the garden. But now, all these activities were infused with a new quality of presence and acceptance. He cared for the temple no longer as a punishment or duty, but as an act of respect for the space that had offered him shelter and teachings. He worked in the garden not to create a perfect version of it according to some external ideal, but to participate in the natural flow of growth and transformation. As the end of his 2 designated weeks approached, he realized he no longer felt anxious about returning to the monastery, nor did he feel attached to staying at the mountain temple. There was a newfound freedom in his relationship with places and circumstances, a recognition that the peace he had found did not depend on external conditions, but on an inner attitude of acceptance and presence. Like a gardener who cannot force a flower to bloom, but can create favorable conditions, the monk had learned to nurture his inner garden through small acts of care and mindfulness. And like any wise gardener, he had learned that each season brings its own challenges and gifts, that perfection is less important than the attentive participation in the continuous cycle of growth and change. On the eve of his departure, he sat once more in the garden he had helped revive. The first stars began to appear in the twilight sky. A gentle breeze carried the fragrance of the flowers he had planted. From somewhere in the distance came the song of a bird, perhaps his friend, perhaps another. It did not really matter. Gratitude, he whispered, to the garden, to the temple, to the mountain, to all the circumstances that had brought him to this moment of clarity and peace. The road descending the mountain looked different now, not due to any change in its physical appearance. The same trees lined its edges, the same stones marked its winding curves, but because of the shift in the monk's perception as he walked it. Where once he had seen only obstacles along a lonely path, he now noticed the beauty in the dancing shadows of the leaves, the music in the gravel beneath his feet, the silent companionship of the mountains watching him depart. He was in no hurry. His master had said 2 weeks, perhaps more, and he had stayed exactly 2 weeks. Not out of obligation, but because he felt it was the right time. The fallen tree blocking the trail had been removed a few days after the storm, but he had chosen to remain until he had completed what he had started, both at the temple and within himself. As he descended, the air grew denser, richer with scents. The distant sound of human voices occasionally reached his ears, reminding him that he was returning to the world of people. Before, he would have felt both anxiety and relief anxiety about what others might think of him, relief and escaping solitude. Now, he simply observed these sensations as they arose, without fully identifying with them. Upon reaching the village at the foot of the mountain, he was welcomed with warm smiles. He had regularly visited these people during his stay at the temple, before and after the storm. But something had changed in his interactions. He no longer desperately sought their company to escape himself. He was present in a different way, truly listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak, genuinely observing, not merely seeking approval. Did the temple survive the storm? Asked the elderly woman who always welcomed him at her door. Yes, he replied with a serene smile, and so did I. She looked at him for a long moment, as if noticing the change, and nodded with quiet satisfaction. After a brief meal shared with the villagers, he continued his journey. The last hours of walking to the main monastery became a natural walking meditation. Each step was just a step. Each breath was just a breath. The path was no longer merely a means to a destination, but part of the journey itself. At last, the great gate of the monastery appeared before him. He hesitated for a moment. This was the place that had been his home for so many years, but also the prison he had constantly tried to escape. What would it be like to return to it now, with new eyes? He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The courtyard was alive with its usual activities, monks sweeping, others carrying water, some studying texts beneath the trees. The routine continued, as always. Yet to him, everything seemed new. seen through a lens of newfound mindfulness. He first went to his master's quarters to report his return. The old monk was meditating when he arrived, but he seemed to sense his presence. He opened his eyes and studied him in silence for a few moments. "Has the temple been repaired?" he finally asked. "Yes, master. The roof no longer leaks and the garden is coming back to life." The old man nodded slowly. "And you?" The question lingered between them, heavy with meaning. The younger monk did not answer immediately. When he did, his words came slowly, carefully chosen. "I realized I had leaks too, gaps where paint seeped in, and that my inner garden had been neglected. I am working on both." A faint smile appeared on the old monk's lips. "Then the gift has been accepted." "Yes, master, though not in the way I expected. The best gifts rarely are." In the days that followed, the monk resumed his duties at the main monastery. He participated in collective meditations, helped with daily chores, studied the sacred texts. Externally, little had changed in his routine, but internally everything was different. The silence between activities, which had once terrified him, was now a space of rest and renewal. The company of other monks, which he had once sought only to avoid loneliness, was now appreciated for its own nature. Even the most mundane tasks, sweeping the courtyard, washing bowls, preparing food, became opportunities to practice mindfulness. He continued tending to a small garden, a space assigned to him on the monastery grounds. The other monks noticed his new dedication to the plants, some even asking for advice or offering to help. He accepted companionship when offered, but no longer sought it compulsively, nor felt diminished when working alone. One afternoon, the monastery received a group of important dignitaries, government officials, wealthy merchants, and their families who had come to pay homage and offer donations. The abbot arranged a formal ceremony, instructing all the monks to present themselves at their best. Observing the commotion around him, the monk noticed how many of his brothers seemed eager to impress the visitors, some practicing special sutras, others polishing ritual ornaments, all seeking, in some way, to stand out or please. There was a time when he would have done the same, desperate for any crumb of external validation. Today, he simply prepared as usual. He washed, dressed in his clean yet simple robes, and presented himself for the ceremony without any special expectations. During the event, while some monks subtly competed for the dignitary's attention, he maintained a serene and attentive presence, performing his ritual duties with care but without ostentation. When the ceremony ended and the visitors wandered through the monastery, he noticed a young novice standing alone in a corner, visibly uneasy. The boy, no older than 16, seemed both eager to participate and terrified of doing so incorrectly. His body carried the familiar tension of wanting to belong, yet fearing rejection. Without hurry, the monk approached the boy and stood beside him in silence for a few moments. He did not demand conversation, nor did he offer immediate advice. Just presence. "This is my first important ceremony," the novice finally whispered. "I'm afraid of making a mistake." The monk nodded, understanding. "Come," he said simply. "Let's prepare some tea." Stepping away from the main commotion, he led the boy to the monastery's kitchen, now empty as everyone was occupied with the guests. With calm, deliberate movements, he set the water to boil, prepared 2 bowls, measured the tea leaves. "Watch the water," he told the novice. "See how it changes, how it goes from cool to warm, how small bubbles form, then larger ones, until it finally boils." At first, the boy was confused by the seemingly irrelevant instruction, but soon he became absorbed in the process. His shoulders visibly relaxed as he observed the transformation of the water. When the tea was ready, they sat on a bench by the window, away from the main commotion, yet still part of monastery life. "On important occasions," the monk said as he sipped his tea, "many of us believe we need to be someone different, wiser, more impressive, more spiritual. But the secret I've discovered is that we only need to be fully present as we are. The young novice studied him with curiosity. How do you do that? The same way we watch water boil one moment at a time, without trying to rush the process, without trying to force the water to heat faster. Just observing, participating, allowing it to happen. They finished their tea in a comfortable silence. Gradually, the boy's anxiety faded. When they were done, he bowed respectfully. "Thank you," he said simply, "not just for the tea." The monk smiled. "Go now. Just be there, one moment at a time." That night, the monk sat in his cell for his evening meditation. Through the small window, the sky was filled with stars, reminding him of his time at the mountain temple. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, allowing the realization to settle within him. And then, unhurriedly, he simply remained present. The true lesson of this journey is that genuine happiness does not depend on external circumstances or companionship, but arises from inner peace and self-acceptance. The path to appreciating our own company is not in fleeing solitude or seeking constant distractions, but in facing our emptiness with courage and compassion. As the monk discovered, our greatest fear, being truly alone with ourselves, is also the gateway to our greatest liberation. When we stop seeking external validation and honestly look within, we do not find the emptiness we feared, but rather a garden waiting to be cultivated. And in that patient cultivation, the ability to be present and at peace blossoms, whether alone or in company. The Buddha taught that all suffering comes from attachment and aversion. When we desperately cling to the company of others or flee from our own solitude in aversion, we miss the opportunity to discover the fullness that already exists within us. True solitude is not a state of isolation, but of wholeness, being complete within oneself, capable of forming authentic connections with others precisely because we do not depend on them to fill an imagined void. Like the lotus that grows in muddy waters yet remains untainted, we can live in the world with all its distractions and challenges and still maintain our inner peace. This is the art of being happy alone and appreciating our own company, not as a second-best option or a consolation for lacking external companionship, but as the essential foundation for a life of authenticity, compassion, and true joy. His understanding was not intellectual, but visceral, felt in every cell of his body. And with it came a wave of compassion, first for himself, and then expanding to encompass all beings who, like him, sought happiness and escape from suffering, often in the wrong places. That night, under a starry sky, the monk sat in the garden with his small bird companion by his side. He no longer needed to speak constantly to fill the silence. A deeper communication was taking place, a silent exchange of presence and acceptance. The next morning, he awoke to find the bird perched on the edge of the open window. Its wings were fully healed, and it flapped them gently, as if testing their strength. "You're ready," the monk said, with a mix of joy and a touch of sadness, which he recognized and accepted as natural. The bird tilted its small head toward him as if it understood. For a long moment, they looked at each other, the man and the bird, both transformed by their brief time together. "Go," the monk finally said. "Live your life fully." With a final chirp, the bird took flight. Its wings beat strongly, lifting it into ever higher spirals until it became just a speck in the vast blue sky. The monk watched until the bird disappeared completely from view. Then, he turned to his daily tasks: meditation, temple repairs, tending the garden. But all these activities were now infused with a new quality of presence and acceptance. He cared for the temple no longer as a punishment or duty, but as an act of respect for the space that had offered him shelter and teachings. He worked in the garden not to create a perfect version according to some external ideal, but to participate in the natural flow of growth and transformation. As the end of his designated 2 weeks approached, he realized he no longer felt anxious about returning to the monastery. nor did he feel attached to staying in the mountain temple. There was a newfound freedom in his relationship with places and circumstances. A realization that the peace he had found did not depend on external conditions, but on an inner attitude of acceptance and presence. Like a gardener who cannot force a flower to bloom, but can create favorable conditions, the monk had learned to cultivate his inner garden through small acts of care and mindfulness. And like any wise gardener, he had learned that each season brings its own challenges and gifts, that perfection is less important than mindful participation in the ongoing cycle of growth and change. On the eve of his departure, he sat one last time in the garden he had helped revive. The first stars began to appear in the twilight sky. A soft breeze carried the fragrance of the flowers he had planted. From somewhere in the distance came the chirping of a bird, perhaps his friend, perhaps another. It didn't really matter. Gratitude, he whispered to the garden, to the temple, to the mountain, to all the circumstances that had brought him to this moment of clarity and peace. He knew this was not the end of his journey. There would be more storms, more moments of doubt and confusion, more traps of comparison and attachment. But something fundamental had shifted. He had looked into the emptiness within himself and found not an abyss to be feared, but a sky to be contemplated. He had confronted his own solitude and discovered not a prison, but a portal to a deeper connection with all beings. What could he say? That he spent his nights escaping to the city in search of superficial connections? That he feared silence as if it were a deadly disease? That he was at the temple as a form of punishment, not by choice? I have maintained my practice at the main monastery, he answered vaguely. Now I'm here for a few weeks of solitary retreat, to deepen my meditation. The words sounded false even to his own ears, but his friend simply nodded, as if accepting his answer completely. When the visitor announced he needed to leave after lunch to reach the next village before nightfall, the host felt a growing desperation. He wanted to stop him, to beg him to stay longer, but he knew he could not. Could you tell me more about your meditation practices before you go? He asked, hoping to hold on to at least a little of the light his friend seemed to carry. The visitor spent the next hour sharing some of the techniques he had learned on his travels. He spoke about breath meditation as practiced by the monks in the north, about observing thoughts as taught by an old master from the east, about contemplating impermanence as practiced in the mountain caves of the west. The host listened intently, trying to memorize every detail, like a starving man watching someone prepare a meal. He made mental notes of the postures described, the breathing methods, the objects of contemplation. When the time for departure finally arrived, the two exchanged the same respectful greeting they had given at their meeting. The host watched his friend descend the mountain path, his figure gradually shrinking until it disappeared among the trees. The silence returned to the temple, but now it felt even emptier, even more oppressive. That night, determined to change, the monk prepared his meditation space exactly as his friend had described. He placed his mat at the precise angle, adjusted his posture to imitate what his friend had demonstrated, even tried to replicate the serene expression he had seen on the other's face. He began to meditate following the instructions he had received, forcing his breath to match the prescribed pattern. For hours, he maintained this strict imitation. But the more he struggled to be like his friend, the more his body ached, the more his mind grew restless. The peace he sought seemed to slip through his fingers like fine sand. Night after night, he repeated the same ritual. He sat exactly like his friend, breathed as he had described, tried to empty his mind as he seemingly could. And night after night, he found only frustration, pain, and growing despair. Then he remembered the Buddha's teaching in the Kalama Sutta, where he warned against following practices merely out of tradition or because others seemed to benefit from them. The Buddha had taught the Kalamas that each person must discover for themselves what brings peace and what causes suffering. I am trying to wear another man's clothes, he thought, sitting alone in the dark. And I am surprised they do not fit. He was trapped in the snare of comparison, trying to be like the other monk, envying his inner peace, imitating his practices without understanding the journey the other had taken to reach them. One night, after another frustrating session of meditation, the monk stepped into the temple courtyard. It was a clear night, and the stars shone brilliantly in the mountain sky. He sat on the cold ground and looked up, feeling small beneath the vastness of the universe. "Who am I, really?" he asked himself. "I am not my wandering friend. I am not the monk my master wants me to be. I am not the cheerful man I pretend to be on my nights in the city. Who am I when all the mirrors are taken away?" The question hung unanswered beneath the starry sky. But for the first time since arriving at the temple, he, Mon,